From Brussels to Lahore and Kabul, governments are struggling to stop violence carried out by extremist groups. Hello, I'm Anand Nayu, and this is The Heat. This week's suicide bombing in Kabul, Afghanistan, marked the deadliest attack by the Taliban in the Afghan capital since 2011. At least 64 people were killed and more than 300 were injured when Taliban fighters blew up an explosives-rigged truck and opened fire inside a government building. The Taliban, Al-Qaeda and ISIL are just a few of the militant groups responsible for a series of global terrorist attacks. Foreign fighters trained in the Middle East have also carried out violent attacks across Europe, most recently in Paris and in Brussels. We begin our coverage with CCTV's Kate Parkinson. She joins us from Paris. And Kate, how is Europe responding in terms of security measures since the Paris and the Brussels attacks?
Well, the European Union has taken steps to implement a counter-terrorism strategy, but ultimately the responsibility does fall on individual member states. So we have seen varying degrees of measures being taken. Here in France, authorities have taken a very hard-line response ever since the attacks last November, in which 130 people were killed in coordinated bomb and gun attacks. Here in Paris, a state of emergency has been in place, giving police enhanced powers. These emergency measures remain in place today, and they're likely to stay in place for the foreseeable future. Certainly, the French Prime Minister has indicated that the government wants them to be extended to at least the summer, when France is hosting the Euro 2016 football tournament. If you remember, back in November, the Stade de France, the national football stadium, was targeted by 3 suicide bombers, and it's in that stadium that the opening and final matches of this huge football tournament will be held. So French authorities very keen to keep the emergency measures in place. Meanwhile, we've seen heightened security at airports across the continent following the Brussels attacks last month, and there's also been numerous police raids and arrests across the continent. One thing that has become very apparent in the wake of the terror attacks here in Europe is the lack of intelligence sharing across the continent. So individual countries doing their own intelligence, but not necessarily sharing it. And certainly this is something that has proved to be counterproductive in a European-wide counter-terrorism strategy.
And Kate, there have been reports that many of the young men who've become radicalized actually became radicalized while they were in prison. They were convicted for some reason, they get into prison, and that's where they become radicalized. And what kind of efforts are being made to stop that happening?
Well, this is entirely correct. And if you remember, many of the suspects linked to the Paris and Brussels attacks had spent time in prison, and observers say it is there that they believe they became radicalized. And so France particularly, and indeed Belgium, are focusing their de-radicalization efforts on prisons. Here in France, a trial program has been rolled out across 5 prisons in which prisoners who are developing or have developed hardline views are isolated and put through an intensive de-radicalization program. But it's highly controversial. Critics say that putting radicalized prisoners together is extremely dangerous, and certainly there is a lot of question as to whether it will be effective. Certainly the de-radicalization units are extremely new, so there's no evidence at this stage as to whether it is going to solve the problem. There's also a lot of disagreement over exactly what the problem is. Certainly some recent studies have said there is a fundamental misunderstanding about what radicalization means. Certainly the understanding so far has been that it is a gradual process in which individuals slowly become more extreme in their views. They turn to religion, they distance themselves from the quote-unquote normal world and become more fundamental in their beliefs. But you only have to look at the videos that emerged of the Abdel Salam brothers, one of whom blew himself up here in Paris, the other who became Europe's most wanted following the November attacks. We've seen videos of them dancing in nightclubs. We've heard stories from their friends of them drinking, smoking drugs, flirting with girls. You only have to look at this to see that the signs of them having become radicalized were not there. And so if would-be jihadists can drift in and out of jihadi behavior and the normal secular world that they live in, then actually spotting people who've become radicalized and therefore being able to de-radicalize them becomes infinitely more difficult.
Okay, Kate, thanks. That's CCTV's Kate Parkinson reporting from Paris. Since January, various extremist groups have escalated their attacks and targeted civilians in the cities of Brussels, Ankara, Lahore, Istanbul and Kabul. So how do governments fight these non-state actors and end the perpetual violence? We'll ask our panel. Joining us now from Islamabad is Imtiaz Gul. He's the Executive Director and founder of the Center for Research and Security Studies based in Pakistan. Here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio is David Gartenstein-Ross. He's a Senior Fellow at the D.C.-based Foundation for Defense and Democracies. And from London, we're joined by Abdel Bari Atwan. He's the founder and editor-in-chief of the Arabic news website, Rai al-Yom. Thanks to all of you for joining us. David, let me start with you. We have these myriad terrorist groups operating in the Middle East, in South Asia, parts of Africa right now. Some of them, of course, are very well known: Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, Boko Haram, but there are myriad other groups. How did it all start? Can we point to a period when it started?
There's a lot of points of inflection one could point to, but I'd point to a few as being particularly important. One of them is the Afghan-Soviet War. When you look at the global jihadist movement, this time in which you had foreign fighters, as well as people who are engaged in humanitarian services, congregate to South Asia, created this space in which militants who otherwise wouldn't have known each other and might have seen their struggle as being a regional rather than a global one were all able to get in contact. Now, the Afghan-Soviet War came just before the explosion in communication, in the way we communicate. That is, the internet became very big in the 1990s and allowed people to stay in contact with each other and to continue to see their struggles as part of more of a global rather than just a regional movement. The second point of inflection, I'd say, is the 9/11 attacks, which showed how a group like Al-Qaeda could fundamentally threaten and challenge a superpower. And I'd say another important point of inflection is the Arab Spring. And we could see each step of the way you had different shifts in communications, from the internet after the Afghan-Soviet War to the rise of non-Western cable television. Al Jazeera was one important point of Al-Qaeda's story during the first decade of the 21st century. And really, when we look at the past 5 years, the social media revolution, which has been able to mobilize people in an unprecedented way, has been a large part of ISIS's story and the post-Arab Spring story.
Abdel, what is your view on this? As David has just pointed out, there are various points when we see the emergence of these radical groups, but to what extent, for instance, did the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq by the United States escalate that process when we saw more and more groups getting more and more violent across the world?
Actually, if we go to the Middle Eastern map in the 70s and before that, we will see very rare existence of these kind of Islamic radical groups. I believe if we want to look at the beginning of this, the strong beginning of these kind of non-state actors, I think we have to go back to the American intervention in Afghanistan, and when they actually recruited, with the Saudi help, a lot of Islamic fighters, jihadi in particular. And started from there. Al-Qaeda was actually born in Afghanistan in a way or another. After that, the other American military intervention in Iraq and then in Libya, now in Syria, this actually created the best incubators to these kind of radical Islamic groups. Once you create a failed states, like what is happening in Afghanistan, what's happening in Somalia, Iraq, Syria, Libya. This is the best environment for this organization to gain strength and to find support among frustrated people in the Middle East.
Okay, Imtiaz, we refer to these groups as non-state actors. Let's take Pakistan as a case in point. You have a whole range of groups there. You have the Pakistan Taliban, known as the TTP. You have affiliates of Al-Qaeda, other groups. What kind of impact do they have on the country, on this fledgling democracy, and on just daily governance in the country?
Well, I think our history also goes back to the 1979, which has been a watershed year, beginning with the Iranian Revolution and culminating in the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And I think much of our radical Islam, the militant groups, basically were born out of the womb of that anti-Soviet American Saudi Arabian-led jihad from out of Pakistan. Because at that time Pakistan was being run by a military dictator who was eventually embraced by the American administration, by the Saudis, and who himself was a religious zealot, and he introduced a number of Islamic controversial Islamic laws into the constitution that laid the foundation of the militant landscape in Pakistan. And they have sprouted, they have proliferated in a way that when 9/11 then eventually happened, again all of these groups became overwhelmed with the emotions, with the sentiment for the Taliban, who were then being under attack by the Americans and the Afghan Northern Alliance. So as a whole, this has created a huge challenge for the state of Pakistan in its governance structures, in its social structures, as well as in politics. So you have a country which is divided among the pro-militant sentiment, which basically is based on one common narrative, regardless of whether it's Al-Qaeda, it's IS, Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, or many other religio-political groups. They are bound by one common narrative. That narrative is one of victimhood, one is of anti-Westernism, anti-Israel, anti-India, and this has then convoluted Pakistan's political realities, and this is what has led to what we call religious radicalization of minds, which basically is discernible not only in the political circles, but also in universities, in the parliament, elsewhere in the socio-political life.
David, when we look at radicalization of these groups, I mean, we've just heard that some of these groups started out as anti-Soviet groups, sponsored, supported, encouraged by the United States. At what point did they turn on the United States, turn in such a way that it led to attacks like 9/11, and in fact has such a huge impact in the world right now that the entire post-Second World War security architecture in the world has changed?
Yeah, even in the 1980s, these groups were anti-U.S. in their outlook, although they weren't fighting the Americans at the time. Bin Laden, for example, never had love for the United States. If you look at the specifics of what turned Bin Laden decisively against the U.S., a lot of it goes back to the first Gulf War, when U.S. troops were stationed in Saudi Arabia. Bin Laden's view of the Ahadith, the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, and one in particular which said there should be no two religions on the Arabian Peninsula, was that this made the U.S. an occupying force rather than a force that was defending Saudi Arabia from Saddam Hussein. And so his first public letter was actually a letter directed to the clergy of Saudi Arabia, which had sanctioned the U.S.'s presence there. And thereafter he became increasingly anti-U.S. The very first terrorist attacks against the U.S. were, number one in Yemen, when U.S. soldiers were heading to Somalia for Operation Restore Hope, where he bombed a hotel where American soldiers would be staying. It didn't kill any Americans. And it's well known that Al-Qaeda had operatives in Somalia prior to Operation Restore Hope, who, for example, liaised with some of the fighters on the ground. There's a debate amongst observers as to whether they had anything to do with the Black Hawk Down incident, but they were certainly there and certainly had capabilities in shooting down helicopters.
Yeah, but just to clarify this, David, because this is not something we hear very often. Osama bin Laden, his main problem was with Saudi Arabia, not the United States.
Well, he had problems with multiple entities. I mean, his first letter was to the Saudi clergy. Right. But his initial break, like the thing which I think pushed him in the biggest direction of militancy vis-a-vis the United States, was specifically U.S. troops being in Saudi Arabia.
Right. Abdel, is this the prevailing thinking among many radical groups, that Saudi Arabia is occupied by the United States and its allies, that this is the desecration of Holy Land that we're seeing here?
Oh yes, definitely. When I interviewed Osama bin Laden in November 1996, he told me that, you know, he will continue fighting until no single American troops on Saudi Arabia or the Arabian Peninsula territories. So he was very clear about that. And in the beginning, he wasn't actually anti-Saudi himself. He was actually financed by Saudi Arabia. He was encouraged by the government there, and he was financed in the first stages of his jihad in Afghanistan by the Saudi government, by the Saudi money. But things changed completely. The presence of American forces, about 500,000 American Western forces on the Arabian Peninsula, definitely considered as insult to Islam and its values by Osama bin Laden and his groups. So but he used this, to be honest, as a cover, as a pretext in order to continue fighting. He has a personal grudges against the United States. He felt, as he told me, that he was used like a used tissue by disposable tissues by United States. They used him and his actually other mujahideen, Arab mujahideen, Muslim mujahideen, and then they throw them away, and they left Afghanistan completely ruined. And also they, instead of learning their lessons from Afghanistan, they sent their troops to Saudi Arabia. So he actually, yes, he has personal grudges and political grudges against the American and the West in particular. Yep.
Okay, we are going to have to take a break right now. More of our conversation about terror groups right after that. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back to The Heat. We're discussing the increase of militant attacks worldwide and how governments are responding. Let's get back to the panel. Imtiaz, when we look at how governments are responding, just a few weeks ago we saw a horrific attack in Pakistan when a suicide bomber killed dozens of people in a park. Now, one theory was that that attack was carried out in retaliation for a military crackdown on radical groups in Pakistan. That puts Pakistani authorities in a very difficult place, doesn't it? Because how does it combat these groups if they are threatened or literally blackmailed in this way by groups that are saying, if you attack us, we will attack soft targets, we will attack civilians?
Well, I think Pakistan is pitched against an enemy that is being used by multiple actors. I think it's also part of the proxy war that that Pakistan is involved in. It's, this India-Pakistan-Afghanistan relationship has been checkered, and regardless which, I would say this is a pattern, the part of the chain of events, terrorist attacks that Pakistan has seen in the last 15 years. They are picking up their targets as they will. At times they are picking up Christians, sometimes other non-Muslim groups, but mostly this is Muslims, Shia Muslims, Sunni Muslims, and this is, I think, a continuous challenge for the government, for the military, regardless whether these groups are hitting back or not. We have to understand that the past about 2 years, there has been a massive crackdown. It has helped in the improvement of the situation. The army has led this from the front. The incidence of violence has come down by more than 50%. However, these terrorist groups, which are either associated with Al-Qaeda, with IS, or Pakistani militant groups who are like proxies for external forces, they've been still operating, because you can't eliminate them altogether.
And David, if we look at the response in Europe, particularly in the aftermath of the Paris and Brussels attacks, as our reporter told us at the beginning of the show, European countries have taken some steps. France has instituted a state of emergency. There's been a tightening of border controls, and there's that anti-radicalization program, which is being conducted actually in prisons in European countries, because they believe that's where a lot of the radicalization takes place. I mean, is that going to be enough?
No, that's not going to be enough. I mean, Europe faces this perfect storm. You have three things that converged, one of which is this massive explosion in foreign fighters going to Iraq and Syria. You have somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 Western Europeans who've gone over, which means that the domestic threat level massively increased as returnees came back. Second, you have this massive influx of migrants into Europe, which stretches intelligence resources as they're trying to determine who's coming in. Jihadist groups, especially ISIS, have used migrant flows to plant operatives in. So that further stretches resources. And then the third thing is with the revelations that Edward Snowden put out about Western surveillance. Suddenly, jihadist groups understand surveillance techniques that are utilized. And there's been an explosion in encryption as a result by people who are very concerned about the effect of government surveillance on individual privacy. There's been much more in the way of apps and other things that allow for end-to-end encryption, where even the company isn't able to de-encrypt the messages that are sent using these applications. And so in the past, European law enforcement and intelligence resources were overstretched. So what they couldn't do with human surveillance, given that it takes about 20 officers to do round-the-clock surveillance, they did with electronic surveillance. Now a lot of that electronics has gone dark. The other problems you have in Europe are, number one, there are very short jail sentences. In France, for example, the average jail sentence for a terrorism offense is somewhere between 5 and 7 years, which means that when you arrest somebody, it'll have an effect of neutralizing them, but only for a limited time, as opposed to the United States or Middle Eastern states where the sentences are much longer. And then the final thing is that the depth and the thickness of these networks is rather astounding. One of the things I've advocated is they should go after jihadist networks not just for terrorism offenses, but for the financial crimes they engage in, the full range of offenses, kind of like the United States did against the mob, in order to try to neutralize and thin down those networks.
But isn't that what the United States has been doing? Because the United States always says you've got to follow the money.
Right, absolutely. In this context, the U.S. has implemented a very similar approach. Now, not identical. What I'm talking about is not just following the money, but in anti-mob activity under Robert Kennedy's Justice Department, they would arrest mobsters for violating the Migratory Bird Act, for killing too many game birds, for lying on federal home applications, which isn't or federal home loan applications, which isn't following the money so much as just finding some crime that someone who's affiliated with the mob has committed and taking him out of the picture and thus thinning down the network. So I think that they have to follow the money, but also they need to thin down these networks. They're large enough that right now European states just can't manage, and intelligence agencies have been all but waving their arms, saying that they can't prevent the next attack.
Abdel, listening to David there talk about what efforts should be made by governments to combat rising radicalism, to combat these terrorist attacks, what about actually looking beyond that, looking at where these problems start, in the ghettos and the slums around Paris, around other cities, which are breeding grounds for radical groups, looking at that and addressing those social problems?
Yes, being in Europe, living in Europe for the last 40 years, I can really saying that the European government failed to integrate, at least 10 million Muslims in Europe. They were actually marginalized in most of European countries, and they never felt actually they are a full citizen. It is not like United States. Once you are in the States, once you got the passport, once you got the green card, you feel you are American, because if, there is no any kind of racism, strong racism against that. The other thing is unemployment. Definitely there is some sort of discrimination when it comes to unemployment. The third important thing is, the underestimation. The problem is, the European government joined United States in intervening in the Middle East and, invading countries, changing regimes, and they expect the Arab population, the Muslim population in Europe to be completely detached from actually what is happening in the Middle East. This is extremely wrong. I believe it is a combination of many elements here. If we want to fight terrorism, if we want actually to beat terrorism, first we have to understand, and we should not underestimate the feeling of the people, whether in the Middle East or in Europe. For example, President Obama said that the biggest regret of his actually presidency is the invasion of Libya. Okay, but why you invaded Libya? Where is the plan B for Libya, for example? Now we have to invade Libya again, and we have maybe to change regimes. We have to fight Al-Qaeda, to fight Islamic State. The same thing in Syria, when the underestimation was very clear, when actually the West, Europe, United States, and Arab government started to intervene in Syria, actually they underestimated the nucleus of Al-Qaeda, the nucleus of Islamic State, which was building there. Islamic State used to sell equal of 3 million barrels of oil, which financed it actually and make it immune from any shortage of money. So this is the problem. Underestimation is the name of the game. What I believe, the European Union, okay, now they are using very effective methods of surveillances, of maybe cracking down on these kind of groups. But the problem is, you have to have a long-term strategy. Those experts should get together saying, how can we tackle this? How can we make Muslim communities in Europe immune from penetration from the ideology of radical organizations like Al-Qaeda, like the Islamic State, like Al-Nusra, whoever. This is what we should look at. Security solution is good, but it is not enough.
Imtiaz, this is often referred to as an unconventional war, and we hear another term that's been used to describe these conflicts. They're called asymmetric wars. States, as we know, have traditionally prepared themselves for conventional wars. Are countries around the world going to be prepared to take on radicals, to take on this war right now?
Well, I think the preparedness is increasing, but so is the danger. And that is rooted in geopolitics. I mean, what we see in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya today, in Afghanistan is all consequences of geopolitics. And as long as international politics is driven and determined by geopolitical considerations, it will serve as the oxygen to groups who would like to thrive on this anti-Western ideologies. So this basically multiplies the threat that the kind of threat that we now see facing a number of European countries, the threat that Pakistan has been fighting, because this ideology is germinating. So regardless whether you are getting 100 new recruits or 1,000 or 500, they are still lethal. They are living bombs. And this is a threat, a continuous threat that most of the states now shall have to live with, and they shall have to face this asymmetrical threat with out-of-box, with non-intrusive methods, basically getting to the core of the masterminds. Without that, it will be very difficult. You can raise walls, you can create more barriers, but you shall have to attack the ideological foundations of all these recruitment centers who are preying on young people, a lot of them frustrated, faced with identity crisis. So I think this is a new kind of threat that all states shall have to find ways to deal with.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. That's Imtiaz Gul in Pakistan, Abdel Bari Atwan joining us from London, and David Gartenstein Ross with me here in the studio. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Knight in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.